Now we can take what we know so far about frames, keyframes, and frame spans and use that to create some crude animation right here in the timeline. What we're going to do is generally referred to in the animation industry as stop motion animation. And actually this is a technique used in a lot of popular movies. If you've ever seen Wallace and Gromit, or possibly some of the old American Christmas series, you've already seen some pretty good examples of this type of animation. Basically, if I'm looking at having my camera do some kind of a motion, let's say fly across to the right-hand side of the screen, I'll need keyframes in order to make those changes. I can go up to my camera layer and simply go to frame 2 and add a keyframe with F6. I'll press F6 and I have a duplicate of the first keyframe. We can make any change we want by simply moving that. And if we want it to continue moving, we can just rinse and repeat, or perform the same operation over again. I'll go to frame 3, press F6. Now we're getting a duplicate of the keyframe in frame 2. I'll move that and make a small change. And we can just do it a couple more times. F6, a little movement, and F6, a little more movement. Now, this is effective. If we scrub our playhead across those frames, we can see the movement we've created. We can even use an interesting technique to see that motion without moving the playhead, and that's called onion skin. Onion skin actually refers to the way animations were drawn in the old days on transparent paper. We can access those tools right here at the bottom of our timeline. And if I turn onion skin on, I can actually extend this span up here, which indicates the frames that I can view on my stage. And in a dimmed view, we can see that motion. Now, this type of animation is effective if you're doing some kind of flipbook type of animation, but for just moving the camera across the screen, it's not very efficient. For one, we had to manually create all the movements. So we're in charge of whether the movements actually look smooth or not when they're played back at full speed. The second problem with this type of animation is it's very difficult to edit because we've got a lot of different elements in here. For instance, if we wanted to have our camera grow as it was moving along the screen, we would simply have to make that change. But now that we've got a whole bunch of keyframes already created, it's very difficult to go back and modify those. I could take this last keyframe, use my free transform tool, and I'll just scale it up a bit. But I'd actually have to go back to each one of these individual keyframes in order to replicate another small scale movement along with the X position movement that we created originally. Another thing that can be either good or bad for this type of animation is these individual keyframes don't necessarily have to have the same artwork on them. When you press F6, it automatically copies the last artwork forward, and that's really convenient if you're just making a small change to it. But let me turn off onion skinning here for a second. I'll just click that back off. And let me go back to one of the keyframes in the middle of the timeline. We've already seen if I have a keyframe selected and I just press the delete key, I won't delete the keyframe, I'll delete what's inside of the keyframe. So I could just remove the camera out of the timeline. Now that creates a little funny animation because my camera is moving along here and bounces into a different position. I could even go back to this keyframe and let's say go into the library and just drag something else out to occupy that keyframe. I'll just grab our photo. Now that's been dragged right into the middle of this timeline. So if I scrub this animation, I actually start with moving camera and we get a big photo, back to camera again, and onward. Now if that's what you intended, that's okay, but you can see there's a lot of room for error in here. What we're going to find out in the next chapter is that we've got much better techniques to actually create this style of animation. But this does explain very clearly how to use keyframes and how to manipulate the contents of keyframes. Now, if you're going to be continuing on, we want to set this file up so it's ready for the next chapter. And in that chapter, we don't need any of these additional keyframes we've created. So I'm just going to select all the keyframes in our camera icon layer except the first one. I'll click on the keyframe in frame 2, and I'll shift-click on the keyframe in frame 5, and I'm going to use my right-click technique. We'll right-click and choose Clear Keyframe, and that'll get rid of all the keyframes we just created. Now, of course, if you're going to be continuing on with your own files, make sure you save these changes so we're ready for the next chapter.